Hi everybody! Today we're going to be going over the best and the worst horror movie tropes. I'm a pretty big horror fan, as I've made well known on the channel. Recently I've been watching tons of horrible to great horror movies, and now that it's Spooky-tober, that's gonna pay off, because today we're gonna be going over the best and worst horror tropes for books or film. That's right, we're transcending mediums here, and we're gonna have a grand old time. I kinda accidentally did like a sci-fi September thing recently. Didn't mean to, just had a random spike of science fiction. That might be an official thing in the future. But now we're going head first into Spooky-tober, starting off with a horror trope list. Well, let's go ahead and just jump on into some tropey things, starting with the death trap, or the overly convoluted death. This has become very popular. One franchise in particular obviously has contributed to this being really a common thing, but now we're seeing in kind of just like every horror film, someone falling down some stairs, bouncing off a wall, tumbling into a pit of zombies as a chandelier falls on them, and then a fiery explosion. Like, it started with it's related to the plot, like there's traps happening, but now I'm just seeing like, what happened to a good old stabbing? What happened to just a good shiv? That's scary. The idea of something puncturing my flesh terrifies me. The ridiculously convoluted deaths can just be comical at times. But I don't hate this. When it's done well, it can make one heck of an impact, especially if you're kind of in the more torture porn side of things, which I am not, and we'll get into later, but I'll just leave this in C because it can be done well, it often's done poorly. It's never gonna make a film for me, but it's rarely gonna break it either, because I don't care that much. Moving on, we have the conveniently abandoned town or city street. Our protagonist has escaped whatever whatchamacallit's chasing them, trying to murk them, and they're out in the street, calling for help. But no one's there. We've seen this many times. I would say it's a staple of slasher movies. They have a small budget, so they're filming almost entirely like a house or at most a neighborhood. They finally get out of the house, into the street around the filming location, and conveniently, no one's there. Hate to break it to you, that's kind of a bit unrealistic. Quick interruption. I'm aware that the scene I just showed from Halloween does have someone witnessing it, but then like turning off the lights and being like, I'm not helping you. And that's actually a part of what I'm saying here. There's just like a certain unbelievability, especially in neighborhoods like that. People tend to look out for each other pretty well, at least in my experience. I don't want to speak for everyone's, but my neighbors have generally been kind of nice. And especially if I was like, hey, someone's trying to murder me. In the real world, I think it's more likely that people will get involved. I've lived in many suburbs. Nosy neighbors are a thing. If I yelled help for 2 minutes, Karen would come out with a shotgun, cell phone, and hair highlights blazing. So I find this one to be a bit unrealistic, but I also think it kind of just needs to be there for these movies to work. So I'm going to drop this in B, because I understand, like, if Michael Myers was chasing Laurie Strode down the road and suddenly like 40 people were dogpiling him, that'd be the end of the movie. So, alright, moving on. The horrifically unfunny comedic relief. I have never seen this more prominent than in the Leprechaun franchise. I watched every Leprechaun movie. Why? Because I'm obsessed with the Dead Meat channel and I wanted to watch them along with him covering them, and wow, these movies are very bad. Granted, I didn't pay like full attention. It was more just like on in the background while I did chores, because that's all these movies are worth. But I don't think of the hundreds of attempted jokes, I laughed once, and this is something you see freaking everywhere in horror. Occasionally the comedic relief works. There are a special few directors who have learned that comedy and horror walk very similar lines, especially when it comes to payoff and timing. When they know that and they use it effectively, then yeah, this can work absolutely really well. But I'm ranking it lower just because the sheer volume of times it's done horrendously. So I'm gonna leave it in B because it can be great. It's often bad. I really wish it was great more often though. So it's a B for me. Now we have the conveniently broken cell phone. Just gonna drop it in C because it's like, I get it, it has to be there for the story to work, but it's annoying and I don't remember the last time I didn't have service. That's a lie. I have T-Mobile. I always don't have service. Bad decision making. This is probably one of the ones that pulls me out of movies the most, where it's like, oh, Johnny's been missing for 40 minutes and there was a blood smear in the bathroom. Why don't we go have the sex now? Why? Stop it. You're dumb, and now I want you to die, and the tension is no longer here. I am interested in protagonists who fight back and display intelligence. One of my favorite examples of this is Hush, which is a movie, if you haven't seen on Netflix, that is spectacular. It's the slasher premise done really differently. Like, he pulls off his mask and introduces himself. He has a lot of character and personality, which you don't see in slashers ever, as well as a really intelligent protagonist. Watch it. And I'm gonna say bad decision making is D tier. The detective working the case. Something that's really common in suspense and horror is to have a cop who's trying to figure out the murders. What's happening here? What's going down? And sometimes they're great, sometimes they're dumb. I have a weird affinity for detective characters, maybe because I'm the biggest Sherlock Holmes fan who's ever walked the earth. You don't know that about me. I've been hiding it. And I'm going to put this in A. I like me a detective. It also fits in world because, like, you know, there should be someone investigating the stuff happening. And it gives another angle in the story outside of just like the people being killed and the murderer. But sometimes it can be done really poorly, so I'm just gonna leave it in A. The summer camp / camping trip / we're just in the woods because it's cheap to film here trope. You'll see this a lot with low budget horror. And in other genres, I'm less forgiving of this, but in horror, being in the woods, being out in nature, kind of just can really lend to the story and be fine. So I'm okay with this. I'm fine with it. It's cool. Another just like needed for the story, but this one bothers me a lot less than almost any other, so I'm gonna put it top of B. But there are so many horror movies in the woods, and once someone tells you the reason that's the case is because it's free and or cheap to film in the woods, you'll never not notice that oh yes, the low budget ones, woods. The ridiculously incompetent cops. I'm not saying there aren't incompetent cops. What I'm saying is that in horror movies, very often they are mystifyingly stupid. And I'm going to put this again in D because it's just like, it's on the bad decision line where it's like, oh, you called the cops and they showed up and they knocked twice, went, hello, anyone here? Well, no one responded. I'm gonna walk in alone with my partner not even called in, with the flashlight on, continuing to call out hello, so that the bloody stains, whoever made those is gonna know exactly where I am. Not gonna call for backup or radio, just gonna wander on, frickin' wander on. The alien creature trope. Oh, one of my favorites. I love a good alien-based horror movie. Obviously, the primo example is The Thing or Alien or Predator, all of which are phenomenal, and except for when it's done poorly, the recent Alien movies. But even then, I am intrigued by the alien life forms. Like, I'll watch a bad movie with an alien in it just because I like alien-based cosmic space horror. Hells yes. So this is going to be an S tier for me because no matter what movie it's in, I'm now more interested because of the alien aspect to it. Except for the latest Predator movie, that was awful and they somehow ruined Predator. It made me sad in a very deep way. The just miscellaneous monster angle. This can be pulled from fairy tales, something created new and original. Think Swamp Thing, Bigfoot, Ghost, ghoul, what have you. Just a random monster pulled from our mythos or ideas, embodying some angle and thrown into the movie. A lot less interested in these, I'm gonna be honest. This is purely a personal preference thing, but every time they're like, oh, in this movie you're being killed by a centaur. That's not scary to me, really. I don't know why, but I much prefer an alien creature. This is purely a personal preference thing, and I'm gonna drop it in C, because the horror parody. Cabin in the Woods is a tremendous example of this. It's one of the best of all time. Horror parody has like a warm place in my heart. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, another really great horror parody. But also parody can be done poorly and just come across as pretentious garbage. So I'm gonna go ahead and say this is a high B. I'll put it in like a, yeah, that's okay B, just because when it's done well, it can be some of the best horror around, surprisingly. I think Cabin in the Woods is a great example of that. That's one of the best horror movies of the last, oh my god, did it come out more than 10 years ago? 15 years, I'll say safely, because time is a mystery to me now. Endless sequels. Oh man, maybe more than any other genre on the planet. Horror franchises are milked to the point where I think there are now 10 Jason movies. That might surprise a lot of you who are like, there's more than a couple. Yeah, there's a lot. There's, I think, in a similar number of Michael Myers involved films, so many aliens. Like, they're, for some reason, because I think they're kind of just cheaper to make in general, if a studio knows like we can get half that audience back in, so let's just go ahead and give this $5 million budget, whatever, and just have them crank out another one so we can make a $50 million like return, and they'll do it again and again and again. Okay, seriously, right now, pause the video, look up the number of Leprechaun movies. Because you're thinking, oh, Daniel watched 3 Leprechaun movies. No. I watched far more than 3. And usually these sequels like deteriorate to the point where they're insanely self-aware and just like, whatever, just... Like, there's one where Jason's in space. That one's actually a surprisingly not horrible watch because they knew this was going to be awful and they just went with it. Also, look how many Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies there are. More than I thought. And the tonal shift? My God. First movie, one of the most disturbing movies of all time. Second movie, much more of like this vibe. It's like a wacky horror comedy, whatever. Moving on. Found footage. I hate this. I think it's only been done well in Wreck. Wreck was a good found footage horror movie, and it's so good. Wreck's awesome. It's so good I won't put this in D, because I do see the potential of found footage. But I, more often than not, detest found footage horror movies. Like, I think they are so poorly acted, usually poorly written. Something about the choice to make them found footage always is like the director's just like, improvise, you can improvise. And it's like, I just graduated from my only acting class and I'm in your movie because I'm cheap to hire and you want me to improvise, right? Okay. So I'm gonna say this is probably the lowest C tier yet, because when I see found footage, I'm much less interested. Another staple also of low budget horror, and I do have a love for low budget horror, but that's just not the kind I like. The adaptation. So many horror movies are based off of books. I think we all know that, but they also tend to be pretty well done when they're based off books. At least a higher percentage, I will say, than just the random schlock we see. But I'm still gonna say I actually really love when a horror book I enjoy is going to be adapted. Even if it's done poorly, I can like it. I don't know why. I if you can't tell from what I've said I've watched, I like bad horror. Like, I enjoy watching bad horror movies because there's something special about bad horror that becomes insanely funny. But I'm gonna go ahead and drop this at the bottom of A. I said the bottom of A. You listen to me, tier list. The Last Girl trope. Outdated, overdone, but enjoyable in certain movies. Halloween is the obvious example. Laurie Strode is the quintessential surviving girl. I'm gonna put this in probably just top of C because it's got tinges of sexism in it. It can be very predictable, and once it's happening, you know how the movie's going to unfold. But there are instances of just Last Girls that were so solid at characters that I actually was just kind of happy to see them make it to that point. Abandoned, haunted, creepy house that people go in. Another example would be Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where our protagonists go into this house that looks horrifying. Why? You're dumb. This is falling into the bad decisions trope. But I do love me some spoopy architecture. Spoopy architecture can be really, really spectacular. I would even say The Shining Hotel falls into this and is a great example. And because they're these solid examples, I'm going to put it above most other things on this list so far. I'm being pretty harsh here. Low budget. I love me low budget horror. As soon as I know something was cheaply made, I'm more forgiving, I'm more curious. Sometimes there are real gems in low budget horror. Many of the films I've already talked about had like fractional budgets, and in terms of return on investment are some of the most profitable movies ever because the directors had like less than 7 figures to work with, and they end up making like tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So because of that, I'm actually gonna put this really high because it's just kind of part of the like business side of horror I'm interested in. I'll put it at the bottom of A. Especially when it comes to the effects in low budget horror, people who will take just the tiniest amount of money and stretch it to really create some beautiful visual effects. The Masked Murderer, very popular for a long time. Now kind of going away, but definitely still has a strong presence in horror overall. This kind of falls into like the alien or mythic monster thing. I think I like masked killers when they're especially done well, more than just random monsters pulled from stuff. I'm gonna put this just above the comedic relief and say that, yeah, If you got a really scary mask and become like an icon because it's so effective, I'm there. Though there's this limit very often put on mask killers where they can have like no personality because it's just like they have a mask on them and they often don't talk, because if they talk, they would sound like this and that's not very scary. So you end up with just a murderous force. Like Michael Myers is just a force of murder. Jason is just a force of murder. Pumpkinhead is a killer I remember seeing in some horrible movie I watched because of Best of the Worst, which is a show on Red Letter Media you should watch. It's great. It's where I find a lot of the bad horror movies I watch. The social commentary in horror. Social commentary in horror actually has a really long tradition, all the way back to Night of the Living Dead. That if you haven't looked into how that came to be, it was borderline an accident or just flat out an accident. It's a remarkably good genre a lot of the times at making some amazing points. Many people are gonna be thinking of Get Out for a prime example as well. I'm putting this top of B. It's only being held down by the fact that it's done poorly a lot too. A lot of really ham-fisted, like, you're trying to talk about sexism right now while people are being torture porned? Great. I decided to throw in the stoner trope as well to go along with Last Girl and the Virgin trope, which we'll talk about later. I do not like stoners in my horror movies because they very often are the worst form of the comedic relief. Bottom of C. I can't think of a stoner character in a horror movie I really enjoy aside from Cabin in the Woods, and again, that's a parody of it, so whatever. Then we have the not needed for some reason, we can't avoid this, it's going to be there, remake of a great movie for a worse version. This happens in horror all the time. I already mentioned Wreck. There was an American remake called Quarantine, which wasn't a bad movie, but it was not as good as Wreck, and it did not need to exist. It was just that weird market thing where it's like, successful foreign version? Should we just introduce that to this audience? No. Let's make a version where we dumb it down for Americans. Happens a lot, and especially in horror, just the remakes, reboots. Michael Myers just got remade or rebooted, or whatever you want to call it, I don't even care. But for me, this is going into D. If you have success, I know the money train is there, and it's really hard to stop rolling in this money pit of a franchise, but we'd all be better off if you would either just leave it alone or actually put the time and effort in to do it well. Tripping while being chased. I hate this so much. It's very bottom. It's just maybe bad decisions and cops. Yeah, it's right there. I'm actually just gonna move the endless remakes and reboots and stuff to the worst possible trope of horror because it's so overdone. It's becoming painful. Slashers. The slasher genre within horror is controversial. Some people think it kind of is just torture porn. Many people thought that until actual just torture porn horror became huge. And now there's kind of this like, oh no, that's torture porn. Slashers are just like halfway there. But slashers are often kind of not the most intellectual the horror genre can be when you're looking at a lot of the other psychological stuff going on. But slashers isn't just this like hard line you can't go anywhere else in your horror movie. I'm not the biggest fan of slashers. I think I'll put this at just top of C and leave it there. I'm much more about like sci-fi horror. That's my favorite horror genre. And there's very rarely like slasher sci-fi horror, though I have heard people make the argument that Alien is a sci-fi slasher movie, and I can't entirely dismiss that. They're not wrong, but there are elements in there that make it different for me. The black character or minority character dying first trope, it's just blatantly racist. There's no defense of it, and it still happens in horror up until like the last 5 years, very, very frequently. Fortunately, now we're seeing it, I think, die away finally, but wow, this was a problem for a long time, and I'm putting it at near the bottom of D because it's just absolute racism. The murder family trope. Put the Texas Chainsaw family here because they're the best example of a murder family I could think of, because wow, the first Texas Chainsaw movie is maybe the most grotesque, disturbing movie I've ever watched. Maybe. That dining scene just got to me, and the old man, I'm just gonna say murder families I'm usually down with. It adds a lot of like perverse angles to the horror, and you can go in some sick directions that will make my stomach twist and want to turn off the movie, but I'm captivated by what's happening, and so I stick around as some like weird part of my brain can't let go what's on screen, even though every logical part of me is like, stop it. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this at the second to top of B. Second to top, I said. Why are you doing this to me? The bad acting trope. Blair Witch Project, I will say, to a lot of people's chagrin. I know some people think those performances are spectacular. To me, they come across as over the top and ridiculous. There's also just, check out, like, I don't know, any of the Jason movies ever, past like 3 especially. Basically, if there's ever a horror movie that has like 4, 5, 6, every single performance will be the worst thing your eyes and ears have been subjected to. I'm going to put this actually kind of surprisingly high, because this is the side of horror I actually enjoy, where I intentionally watch the bad ones because they make me chuckle. And I'm gonna put this low C, just above found footage. It's just, there's like an odd enjoyment out of watching like Leprechaun 342, where he's in space and the performances are so over the top. It actually feels like you're watching what aliens think human cinema should be. Like, there's just this disconnect. It's fascinating. The outstanding performance, specifically the outstanding dark, twisted, psychological breakdown or exploration performance. I realize just great performance isn't necessarily tied to horror, but I'm talking about like the psychological stuff you will see in certain movies and the de-evolution of the human mind that can happen through these extreme circumstances. The horror genre has had some of the greatest performances in the history of film, and for some reason the Oscars continue to ignore it. I'm talking, if you want recent examples, Witch, Split, the amazing performances by actors who go to dark places. I think the most iconic of all time would probably be Jack Nicholson in The Shining, but the Oscars, the completely bought and paid for award ceremony that it is, completely ignores the horror genre and will just never give the actors who pour their heart and souls into these crazy, difficult performances to do the respect they deserve. So I'm taking this and putting it in the second S tier, probably the top one. I put Split. James McAvoy in that movie is otherworldly. If you can't tell, I have beef with the Oscars. I think I've made that really clear in the last few months on this channel. I hate it. I hate them a lot. I watch them because it's like I have to, but I watch them because I hate them. Jump scares. I get some people like jump scares, and I'm not gonna be one of these snobs who tells you there's no good jump scares, it's just lazy. There are earned jump scares. Wreck is filled with them. It's just not my kind of horror. I like suspense. I like really well earned and paid off like fear that will live in me forever, which is a really good example of that. Like, I wasn't actually scared watching the movie. It wasn't until afterwards, where I was alone in my apartment, that I was like, there's a feeling that won't leave me. And no jump scare dependent horror movie has ever done that to me. Although I'm not gonna dismiss, if you just want to get a little bit of an adrenaline ride, that's okay, and you can like this kind of horror, but for me, it's going just below found footage. The always missing or just shooting them in ways that for some reason don't kill them, even though they're just a man, aka Michael Myers, and a lot of other horror killers. I always just kind of wonder at this, like, you can easily write around it so that they're not being shot at. You are writing a situation where they're being shot at, and they're hit or missed in just ridiculous ways. You can do it well to demonstrate how much of like a killing force these people or things or creatures or monsters are, but it still just bugs me. I'm gonna put it just below bad acting. The virgin trope, kind of blatantly sexist, I subverted on this tier list by making it a man because hashtag 2020. Oh my god, that's the most annoying thing I've ever said. I'm going to go ahead and just drop this in D as well. It's something I never even really understood, because I just never had this idea of like purity in my life growing up, so I was always just like, because this person's never been laid, they're alive? I don't get it. That's just another annoying one that maybe annoys me slightly less than the endless sequels, the racism, and the remakes. Yeah, this whole bottom 5, I just hate and detest. And then finally, torture porn. I gave jump scare people a lot of slack because I'm like, yes, there is just an angle I understand there for just adrenaline. But when it comes to these people, the people who just want to watch humans suffer with a thinly veiled plot of an excuse to just show convoluted, over the top, gory, bloody deaths, I just want you to know I do not get it. I don't get it at all. It has zero appeal to me. I'm not trying to talk down to you. I'm not trying to say you're wrong, but it doesn't even register as horror in my brain. It just registers as gross. Like, I can't imagine going like Silence of the Lambs being in the same genre as like Saw, I don't know, 32. Is that what they're up to? And I was okay with this when it was relatively relegated to the Saw franchise, but now there's so much torture porn in horror. I don't understand why. It's something I now have to like look out for and avoid, because it's like, oh, maybe this horror movie, nope, that one's just torture porn too. Hey. And it's actually one of the reasons why I like the Dead Meat channel, because I will watch, okay, his little recap, like beginning bit of a horror movie to see if this is just going to be dumb torture porn. And if it is, I know to avoid it. Especially that was one with like the one with the mutant brothers that were running around. I watched like his first little bit of the first movie in that franchise and had to go, great, not going to watch that one because that's all that seems to be. So this is going to probably just below the sexism, because I find it genuinely kind of disturbing when I meet someone who just wants to talk about the deaths and convoluted kills in these movies that have no appeal to me whatsoever. But this is my horror trope list. It's maybe the most negative tier list I've ever done. I didn't expect that going in. I thought I was going to be more generous, but wow, this is a middle to bottom heavy horror trope list where I feel like I was a bit too mean for a genre I love. I think it's because I have a lot of opinions on where it's going wrong and what's still being done right. So it's a genre I actually want to have a lot of conversations about, but because my channel's not focused on that, I haven't yet. Luckily, it's Spoopy-tober, and I have an excuse to, starting with this video. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And let me know what tier list you'd like to see in the future. I'll probably get at least one more in for October, so let me know what horror, spoopy-related tier list you'd like to see, because I'll probably do another one. Have a good one. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Hannah Felicitas. Hope I said that right. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.